Okay, so now we have discussed the canonical Gospels. What about some of the other Gospels that you may or may not have heard about? Sometimes in the news we hear about the Gospel of Mary or the Gospel of Thomas, or maybe you've picked up alternate textbooks for New Testament studies, and there's a chapter in there in the Gospel of Thomas, where people have made the point of it should be included in your studies, and maybe it should, you think. So let's briefly take a look at that. So throughout history, we have found what we call libraries, which are collections of writings. One of them is the Nag Hammadi find in the 20th century. So a small village town along the River Nile in Egypt. It's typical that we find ancient manuscripts in arid environments. So Egypt, it's very dry. There's a lot of sand. And so when you have writings that need to be preserved, it preserves better, especially with the animal or plant products, if it is excluded from oxygen in a fast manner, so that preservation takes longer. And so that's where we get these collections. And the Nag Hammadi library contains what we call Gnostic writings. We also have, for example, the find of what we call the Oxyrhynchus library, perhaps less well known. That was in 1898. And you see here how the Nag Hammadi find relates to Oxyrhynchus. So you have here the country, the African country of Egypt. You see the Sinai Peninsula, here you see the Delta, and then you can, of course, isolate here the Nile River. And along the River Nile, makes sense, right? You have these little villages. Oxyrhynchus is actually just a little town there, and onward down. If today you would take a cruise or something, you would river cruise, you would go on to Luxor, that people are known because the little pyramids and all that, little things. So in 1898, some British explorers were looking for treasures, to be honest, and you often could find treasures in the area of tombs. And so they were digging for that. And you can see that here. You can see a picture of tombs and small village remains. And so they stumbled upon a garbage heap, and somebody else's trash is somebody else's treasure, right? And so as part of funeral rites, they would put beautiful masks over people's mummified bodies. And they would stuff them with plant products, papyrus products. Well, they also used papyrus, as you can see an example here, to write on books, ancient books, Bible scrolls, Bible book bindings, but they also would use it for like contracts, like dowries, or a transfer of goods, like animals. And so whenever they would need to make copies of it, then they would discard the old ones and put them in the garbage heap, because they would use that to make a little bit of a mush and use that to make these funeral masks, and they would paint those and all. And so it was discarded. So that became a treasure, because once they could dig that up in these garbage heaps, they discovered that these discarded documents contained ancient writings like the Iliad, but they also contained ancient writings of Christian communities. So we have actually found some precious ancient documents. We actually found New Testament writings, but this is also what we find early writings, such as writings from other Gospels. The same in Nag Hammadi. Some of them are leather bound, and some of them are on papyrus. So this is where we get our finds. And like I said, they tend to concentrate around Egypt, because they're well preserved there, and because people had these practices, and so they would use discarded materials. So we have what we call Gnostic Gospels. So the Gnostics were our early communities that had different philosophies of life. You're reading about that, and they would write down their own versions of the Jesus story, and hence we would call that Gospels. So we have, for example, the Gospel of Mary, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Thomas, and the Gospel of Judas. So notice that they would invoke names of people that we know from the Jesus stories, but when we date these materials, they date way later. So in other words, after Mary, Philip, Thomas, and Judas, for example, would have passed away. And this is not uncommon in antiquity, that we use pseudepigraphy, like names of people. That's really not the problem. It's more the date of these documents, right? And the communities that they come out of. They typically are written in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th century, so that kind of removes us from the story. The canonical Gospels are typically believed, not by everybody, but the majority of people believe that they are written in the 1st century. So you're closer to the origin of the Jesus community, and so it's typically deemed problematic that it's so far removed from the actual life and ministry of Jesus. So that's one of the reasons why you don't see them in the Bible. And it also means that these communities have lived on and developed their own views on things. Gospel of Thomas tends to be the one that people like most because there is overlap with the materials like in the canonical Gospels. Here you see actually an old manuscript. Notice that it has Greek letters. This is from John, Apocryphon. So this is the ending of the Apocryphon of John and the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas. So this is found in Nag Hammadi. So there you see that they actually, once upon a time, in that area, they kind of put the stuff together. You know, sometimes people keep stuff. And even today, we have different places where people have different beliefs. So yeah, we have some finds where people mix that. Let me go back here for a minute. So sometimes people say, like, you know, why don't we include the Gospel of Thomas, for example? In the Gospel of Thomas, there are some stories where it's not really stories, it's more like sayings of Jesus, where he says things. It sounds like Jesus is telling parables, or he has some sayings. So first, one of the reasons that I think that most Christians are uncomfortable with that is, number one, it's a later document. It comes like out of the 3rd or 4th century, so it's far removed from it. Some of the things that Jesus says sounds more like the things that the people in the 4th century would believe about Jesus than what Jesus believed about Jesus at the time, if that makes sense. So, sometimes I ask Christians, like, I ask students, like, do you think that the Gospel of Thomas should be in there? And if you have a cursory kind of knowledge, like you just kind of Googled it and they're like, yeah, sayings of Jesus, you might be inclined to just go, yeah, it should be in there. And it's kind of, why don't we have it? But I would invite you to take a thorough look at it, okay? Before you make statements, make sure that you have all the information. Because look at this, at the very end of the Gospel of Thomas, this is the statement. It talks about Peter saying this to Jesus. Peter says to Jesus, let Mary go away from us because women are not worthy of life. Whoa. Now, this is, words into the mouth of Jesus, into the mouth of Peter. And then Jesus answers Peter in that writing, look, I shall lead her, Mary, to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit, resembling you males. For every woman who makes herself a male will enter into the kingdom of heaven. So now we see that part of these Gnostic beliefs of the way the community functioned and what they thought about Jesus is really kind of about inequality, right? In fact, it espouses this idea that the male disciples who had been under the tutelage of Jesus for 3 years actually at that point believe that women are not really worthy of life. Men are that much more important. And that Jesus actually believes that males are superior, that in order to be a quickened spirit, females should become changed and should become males in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. So before people say, I think the Gospel of Thomas should be in the Bible too. After all, it sounds a lot like Jesus, and why don't we have it? I want to invite you to always do thorough research, because of course you have the liberty to believe that. You can believe whatever you want. It just means that at that point, you then also believe that this is what Jesus came to preach. And I don't know about you, but personally, I would have a problem with Jesus believing that I, as a woman, have to first become a man. I have a problem with Jesus who believes that men are so much better that I have to become a man in order to even be close to God. I don't believe that that's consistent with the rest of the Bible. I don't believe that that's consistent with how I see Jesus act around men and women. I think actually Jesus did the very opposite. I think he actually went over and said, we're just not treating women the way society is treating them. I think everybody is equal and we provide dignity to all. So that's kind of like the idea there. Another thing was sometimes you have missing information. Remember, so we kind of have some birth narratives very briefly, right, in the canonical Gospels. Matthew kind of picks up after the birth of Jesus. Luke is the only one that has somewhat of a birth narrative and then jumps to Jesus already being a teenager, which is very typical because they're not normal biographies. They are lives, Greco-Roman lives, which emphasize the key events. Well, but you go forward, for a couple of centuries later, people wanted to know, what kind of child was Jesus? And they kind of became a little bit obsessed with it. So people started to fill in the blanks. We love to fill in the blanks, right? So you get what's called these infancy gospels, the infancy gospel of Thomas, the infancy gospel of James, the history of Joseph the carpenter. What was his dad like? And so people just started to collect all these mythological sort of stories and wrote them up. Well, then you get funny stories. So here you see a little bit of a piece of art from a long time ago. The infancy gospel of Thomas. When the boy Jesus was 5 years old, he's playing out in the stream. So he makes water into pools and notice what it says. He gathered disturbed water into pools, made them pure and excellent. So they try to kind of work together with this idea that Jesus is God and the creator of all. And he, at one point, was a little boy. Then he takes soft clay from the mud, and out of the mud, he makes sparrows. So again, they're trying to figure out how do you deal with the fact that Jesus is fully God and he becomes a human being. They go like, well, I guess that means as a little boy, he was still kind of creating stuff. Okay. And then it's Sabbath, it's a Jewish holiday, and he's playing with children. And then a certain Jew, seeing the boy Jesus with the other children, went to his father and falsely accused the boy Jesus, saying on the Sabbath he made clay and he made 12 sparrows, because in Jewish belief you were not supposed to do work. And he goes, that boy is doing what he's not supposed to do, right? So then his earthly dad, Joseph, comes and says to Jesus, why are you doing work on the Sabbath? And then Jesus claps his hands and shows that he is God. He takes these clay birds and make them come alive and say, go, and then the birds fly away. So this is how people are dealing with this tension between God being fully God and being fully human in Jesus. Or they deal with this, what would it be like for Jesus to go to school? What is it like for God to know everything and yet to become a human being? So then they give a scene where Jesus is actually in school, and stuff happens. And so the teacher confronts Jesus and brings him his father. And so he says, bring him into the school and I'll teach him, So the schoolmaster, flattering him, took him into the classroom, and Jesus is silent. And they even give him a name, Zacchaeus. It's funny, right? Writes the alphabet for Jesus and begins to teach him the letters. And he tells Jesus, repeat after me. And Jesus is kind of, I imagine, rolling his eyes. And Jesus becomes irritated. And so the teacher, being a teacher at the time, strikes him on the head. The boy becomes angry. So they give Jesus very human emotions, right? And says, a smith's anvil, when struck, teacher, whoever strikes it. And when it's not the anvil which is taught, I know the letters which you're teaching more accurately and far, but I'm better. And you're like a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal, which is very interesting. That kind of language is actually out of a letter later on in the New Testament. So he's actually quoting from a letter later on. And so it kind of unrolls there. And so you kind of see kind of like a snobby sort of Jesus. So they give him like a rebellious sort of human spirits because he knows everything. So these are just human efforts to fill in the blanks. There's actually also a story where a little boy falls off the roof and they accuse Jesus, and Jesus goes down and raises this kid from the dead. So these are all efforts to fill in blanks. And so what we can learn from these documents is we can kind of learn what it was like to be in these early Christian communities and struggle with big theological questions. What was it like to have Jesus walk in our midst and be God, and at the same time dwell among people? And I think we still today have these questions. So they're honest questions. It's just when we put stories together, I don't think it's necessarily the stories that have the merit, but maybe we can learn from the questions and maybe recognize, hey, I have some of the same questions, and not shy away from the questions. The questions are okay. All right.